The invitation arrived through official diplomatic channels in January, an ornate envelope bearing the seals of both the Israeli Football Association and the Tel Aviv municipality, containing a formal request for Ronaldo to serve as the guest of honor at a prestigious international football gala that would celebrate the sport's role in building bridges between cultures and promoting peace through athletic competition. And the event organizers had clearly invested significant effort in creating an invitation that emphasized humanitarian themes and cultural exchange, while downplaying the political context that made Tel Aviv a controversial location for any public figure who had previously spoken about Palestinian rights and the impact of Israeli policies on civilian populations throughout the occupied territories. The gala was scheduled for March and was being promoted as a celebration of football's universal appeal that transcended political boundaries and brought together athletes, officials, and fans from around the world in recognition of sport's power to unite people across cultural and religious differences. But the timing of the event, coming just months after Ronaldo's public statements about Gaza and his criticism of international silence regarding Palestinian civilian casualties, made his participation particularly significant for organizers who understood that his presence would be interpreted as endorsement of Israeli policies and normalization of relationships that Palestinian advocates argued should remain suspended until meaningful progress was made toward ending occupation and addressing systematic human rights violations. The financial incentives attached to the invitation were substantial, including a €2 million appearance fee, first-class accommodation, private transportation, and additional compensation for participating in youth football clinics and media interviews that would showcase Tel Aviv as a modern, progressive city where international celebrities felt comfortable visiting and where sporting events could proceed without the political complications that affected other parts of the Middle East. And these generous terms reflected the organizers' understanding that securing Ronaldo's participation would represent a major public relations victory that could help counter negative international publicity about Israeli policies, while demonstrating that prominent global figures were willing to associate with Israeli institutions despite ongoing controversies about treatment of Palestinian populations. The pressure to accept the invitation came from multiple sources, including Ronaldo's commercial representatives, who emphasized the financial benefits and networking opportunities that could result from participating in an event that would be attended by influential sports officials, business leaders, and political figures from across Europe and North America. But this commercial pressure was countered by messages from Palestinian advocacy organizations, human rights groups, and individual Palestinians who urged him to decline the invitation as a gesture of solidarity with people who were facing systematic oppression and who viewed normalization activities as undermining efforts to maintain international pressure for policy changes that could improve conditions for civilians living under occupation or blockade. The decision-making process that followed involved extensive consultation with legal advisors, political experts, and human rights organizations who helped Ronaldo understand the broader implications of his choice, including the ways that celebrity participation in Israeli cultural events was part of a deliberate strategy to counter international criticism through high-profile normalizations that suggested global acceptance of controversial policies, and how declining such invitations could contribute to maintaining pressure for accountability and policy changes that might eventually lead to improved conditions for Palestinian civilians whose voices were often excluded from international discussions about Middle Eastern politics and conflict resolution. The announcement of Ronaldo's decision to decline the Tel Aviv invitation was made through a carefully worded statement that avoided inflammatory language, while making clear that he could not participate in events that might be interpreted as endorsement of policies that violated international law and contributed to ongoing suffering of civilian populations. And his statement emphasized that his decision was based on consistent principles about human rights and justice, rather than any hostility toward Israeli people or Jewish communities, but rather reflected his commitment to using his platform responsibly in ways that supported oppressed populations rather than governments whose policies he had previously criticized for their impact on innocent civilians. The reaction to Ronaldo's refusal was immediate and intense, with Israeli officials expressing disappointment and suggesting that his decision reflected ignorance about the complexity of Middle Eastern politics and the security challenges that justified policies he had criticized, while Palestinian advocates praised his consistency and moral courage in choosing principles over financial incentives that could have provided significant personal benefits, but would have required him to compromise his stated commitment to human rights and justice for all people, regardless of their nationality or religion. And international media coverage focused on the precedent his decision might set for other celebrities who faced similar choices about participating in events that carried political implications beyond their apparent sporting or cultural purposes. The legal challenges that followed Ronaldo's refusal were based on claims that he had violated preliminary agreements to consider the invitation seriously, and that his public criticism of the decision to decline had damaged Israel's international reputation in ways that justified financial compensation. But these challenges were unsuccessful because Ronaldo's legal team had carefully avoided any commitments that would have required his participation, and because his statements about declining the invitation had focused on general principles rather than specific accusations that could be considered defamatory or legally actionable under international law that protected freedom of expression, including the right to decline invitations for political or moral reasons. The economic consequences of Ronaldo's decision included the loss of immediate financial benefits from the Tel Aviv ventas, or potential complications for future business relationships with companies and organizations that had investments or partnerships in Israel, and might view his refusal as politically motivated decision-making that could affect their own commercial interests in markets where support for Israeli policies was considered essential for business success. But these short-term costs were balanced against long-term benefits of maintaining credibility with audiences who valued consistency between stated principles and actual choices when moral considerations conflicted with financial opportunities. The foundation that emerged from the controversy became focused on supporting Palestinian cultural and educational programs that were often underfunded or disrupted by political circumstances that made normal development activities difficult to sustain. And these programs provided alternatives to normalization events by creating opportunities for international engagement that centered Palestinian voices and experiences rather than ignoring or minimizing them, in favor of activities that portrayed conflicts as equally balanced disputes between parties with equivalent moral claims, rather than situations involving systematic oppression that required clear moral positions from people with influence and platforms. The cultural exchange program that Ronaldo established provided scholarships for Palestinian students and artists to participate in international programs that had previously been inaccessible due to travel restrictions, funding limitations, and political obstacles that prevented normal cultural and educational exchanges. And these opportunities helped ensure that Palestinian perspectives and talents could reach international audiences without requiring participation in events that might compromise the political principles that motivated restrictions on normalization activities, that could undermine pressure for policy changes that addressed underlying causes of conflict, rather than just managing its symptoms. The sports development initiative that grew out of Ronaldo's refusal to participate in the Tel Aviv event focused on building football infrastructure and training programs in Palestinian territories where such activities face significant challenges due to restrictions on movement, limited resources, and security concerns that made normal athletic development difficult, but not impossible, with adequate support and international advocacy that could help overcome political obstacles to sporting activities that should have been available to all young people, regardless of their geographic location or political circumstances. Years later, when other prominent athletes had followed Ronaldo's example by declining invitations to events in Israel, until meaningful progress was made toward addressing Palestinian rights and ending occupation policies, when the cultural boycott movement had gained momentum, partly due to celebrity participation that brought mainstream attention to previously marginal advocacy campaigns. When some policy changes had been implemented, partly in response to international pressure that included cultural and sporting boycotts alongside economic sanctions and diplomatic initiatives, Ronaldo would reflect that refusing the Tel Aviv invitation had been one of the most important decisions of his career, because it had demonstrated that moral principles could not be purchased through financial incentives or compromised through social pressure, and that true leadership sometimes required choosing consistency with stated values over immediate benefits that would have undermined credibility and moral authority that were more valuable than any single event or relationship that required abandoning commitments to justice and human rights that formed the foundation of meaningful public advocacy for oppressed populations whose suffering deserved attention and action, rather than normalization and acceptance as inevitable features of international relations that prioritized stability over justice.